In this podcast, I set out to provoke the listener to think more carefully about the nature of methodology. My intent, though, is not to present this as a set of purely abstract principles, but as a lived component of academic practice, as something that we do, as well as talk and write about. In this context, my aim is to orient the listener to a more sensitive way of thinking about methodology in the context of their emerging academic being. Without a deeper anchoring in practice, treatments of methodology can too easily be reduced to a simple description of the ways in which research methods have been designed and implemented in a particular study. Alternatively, more sophisticated accounts can begin to grapple with some of the strengths and weaknesses of research methods, or accounts of the processes of design and the limitations that these pose for conclusions. This sense of an exploration with increasingly sophisticated layers offers glimpses of the deeper significances of methodology in academic practice. But it does so at a tangent, one which demonstrates what methodology is and is for in relation to one particular articulation of it. Understanding methodology therefore requires that we go beyond a fixation on research methods in order to ask what lies under the surface of these treatments, what the purpose of methodology is. When we disconnect research methods from the previous slide, we're left with some notions which are useful in helping us to understand the deeper sense of methodology. We're left with a notion of process and a sense that we should recognise and articulate that process in order to both justify it and to recognise that it has flaws which limit the extent and nature of our arguments. I would suggest that this framing offers a more direct sense of the significance of methodology, as a recognition that any knowledge or understanding that we as academics communicate comes from somewhere. It arises from a particular process and procedure. Regardless of particular subject disciplines, and regardless of the particular execution of methodology, we expect that procedure to be systematic, that it will have a planned nature, or at least an emergence that has been managed in a considered and thoughtful way. The notion that knowledge is generated through rational inquiry is the foundation of academic practice. Methodology is, therefore, not about technical execution, but about much deeper philosophical concerns. We communicate it and invite debate and discussion about it for these same reasons. It exists as part of our public practice, not just our private thinking, so that we can talk with honesty and integrity as part of the academic community. Exploration around methodology enables us to explain where our propositions are coming from, and therefore to allow us to defend them as valid and reasonable understandings of the world. Equally, it exposes that there are inevitable ambiguities and limitations to the processes that generated those propositions. These two representations are crucial to our integrity and to that of our work. They enable our arguments to stand amongst the dialogue of the broader community, for the reader or the audience to be persuaded both by the rationale of our process and the honesty of our treatment, and for them to appraise our conclusions independently in light of where they have come from. In brief, the rationality of the academic community is not a natural product of our internal logics. It's what happens when that community talks about that logic and reason. It's the outcome of a constant and ongoing dialogue, of what Habermas might call a communicative rationality. I would suggest that this way of thinking about methodology brings with it some concrete suggestions for how you orient yourselves as a student and an academic practitioner. Firstly, and most fundamentally, account for the systematic nature of your inquiries, that the journey towards a particular set of assertions or conclusions has its own nature. Pay attention to the logic of your work and render it transparently to the reader. This principle is true regardless of the nature of the work. An essay based on argumentation or a review of literature has a logic and a methodology as much as a piece of research as it's often conceptualised. Don't treat methodology as something to be picked from a shelf of pre-designed approaches. Think carefully about what you're exploring and the best ways of orienting to that challenge, and feel free to test the boundaries. If we accept Habermas's sense of communicative rationality, then what is legitimate and valid as an approach to knowledge generation isn't a given. It's the outcome of a community that's constantly experimenting and talking about that experimentation. Secondly, treat the logic of your work as something which should be discussed and explored. Give the audience an insight into its mechanics and processes. Allow them to understand how it was produced, and the ways in which it allowed you to generate a particular version of the world and a particular set of propositions. Finally, and often most challenging for students, don't be afraid of the problematic elements of that approach. There's no such thing as a perfect methodology, particularly where you're studying complex subjects such as human beings. All academic work is fraught with tensions and limitations, and these impose restraints on the extent of our conclusions. This necessitates that we communicate to our audience the buts and howevers around which they should read our propositions. We can and should work to minimise some of these problems, but it's inevitable that many will remain. Often, the impulse of students can be to try to tidy away the mess, to obscure what they perceive as weaknesses in the finished writing. The frame of reference established in this podcast, however, suggests that we should strive for the opposite, that we should allow the reader to see those problematic aspects of our methodology. Such an approach is not to abandon the significance of our work, it just lets the audience decide for themselves, and to have trust in our broader project. It also represents our way of contributing to the deeper academic community, that communicative rationality, through which we negotiate valid and legitimate ways of understanding the world. In this podcast, I've outlined a particular way of thinking about methodology in your own academic practice. My intent has been to help you to see the deeper significance of this aspect of academic practice and to move beyond a technical sense of how we organise research methods. There are a number of different ways that you can now start to develop methodology in your own practice, and 3 possible directions are explored in podcasts connected to this one. One way in is to think about the nature of the research question. After all, the ways in which you operate as an academic inquirer is fundamentally shaped by your own conception of what it is you want to understand. Implicit in your questions will often be assumptions about the nature of your subject matter, and this exposes a second way of understanding methodology. You can begin to interrogate how the methodologies of your approaches are underpinned by particular philosophical constructs of the nature of knowledge and the nature of the reality you intend to study. Finally, where exploration is of the social world, it will have ethical and political implications, both in its processes of knowledge generation and in its consequences. Often, these kinds of concerns are saved as something to be considered slightly separate from the central consideration of methodology. But I would suggest that they are as fundamental as any philosophical commitment, and thus worthy of interrogation in this theme. I present these as 3 ins to further development of methodology in a loosely framed way, and I leave it to the listener to navigate them according to their own leanings as an emerging academic practitioner.